The poorest counties in Eastern America sit on top of more extracted wealth than most countries have ever produced. Coal, timber, chemicals, natural gas, silica, pulled from these mountains for 150 years, shipped to every city you can name. None of the money came back. Here's why. Every time you flip a light switch, there's a decent chance the electricity moving through that wire started as a chunk of rock buried inside a West Virginia mountain. Not symbolically, literally. For most of the 20th century, Appalachian mines produced the majority of the nation's coal, and coal generated the majority of the nation's electricity, which means the single largest share of America's power came from these mountains. The steel forged from Appalachian metallurgical grades built the bridges, skyscrapers, and rail lines that hold the country together. The mountains that isolated the people who lived there are, in the most physical sense possible, made of the fuel that powered everyone else. That's not a metaphor. The Appalachian mountain chain formed from collisions between tectonic plates hundreds of millions of years ago, compressing ancient swamp forests into coal seams stacked in formations hundreds of feet deep, then folding and tilting them into the same ridges that block highways and cut off valleys today. The geology that created the resource is the same geology that trapped the people next to it. One process, two consequences. And when the outside world figured out what was under those ridges, it didn't build communities, it built plumbing. The railroads tell the story better than anything else. The Chesapeake and Ohio, the Norfolk and Western, the Virginian, these weren't passenger lines, they were coal conveyors. Miles of track bored through tunnels and carved along river gorges for one purpose: get the coal out. In some hollows, a train hauling 10,000 tons of fuel would roll past houses with no paved road to the nearest town. The infrastructure went right through the community and connected to nothing inside it. It was extraction architecture, engineered to move a resource from the ground to the grid, from the seam to the steel mill, with as few stops as possible. At peak production, trains left the coal fields of southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southwestern Virginia around the clock. Not a couple per day, dozens. The total tonnage is hard to make real at human scale, but over the last 150 years, the coal pulled out of Appalachian mountains could bury the island of Manhattan under a staggering depth of black rock. That coal became the electricity in living rooms across Ohio, the coke in blast furnaces in Pittsburgh, the heat in factory boilers in New York. The energy didn't stay, and neither did the money. That's the part that turns a resource story into a settlement story. Coal companies didn't just mine coal, they built the towns. Company towns, hundreds of them scattered across the coal fields, were owned top to bottom by the mining operation. The company built the houses, ran the store, hired the only doctor, paved the single road in. And in many of those towns, miners were often paid not in US dollars, but in scrip, company-issued currency that could only be spent at the company store, at prices the company set. You worked inside the mountain, you lived in the company's house, you bought your groceries with the company's own fake money. And when the seam thinned out, or the price of coal dropped, the company packed up and left, and so did the town, because nothing else was holding it there. The settlement pattern was never meant to outlast the resource. That's not a failure of planning. That's the plan working exactly as designed. Think about what that means at scale. Every one of these company towns was a temporary extraction camp dressed up as a community. Schools, churches, baseball leagues, real human life happened there. Kids grew up, people married, generations were born and buried in those hollows. But the legal and economic foundation underneath all of it was a labor camp with a timer set by geology. When the coal seam ran thin, the machinery moved one ridge over, and the people were left in houses they didn't own, on roads nobody maintained anymore, in towns that no longer had a reason to exist. And the mountains that made the coal also made the isolation nearly permanent. Appalachian terrain isn't gentle rolling hills. It's narrow valleys separated by steep, sharp ridges. And the only flat ground is along creek bottoms barely wide enough for a two-lane road. Building infrastructure through this landscape costs many times what it costs in flat country. So when the coal companies pulled out, The communities they abandoned weren't just jobless, they were physically stranded. The rail line that once carried coal didn't carry passengers. The roads the company had maintained went back to gravel. The geography that created the wealth also sealed the door shut behind it when the wealth left. What remains is a region that powered the industrial rise of the entire eastern United States and received in return depleted seams, black lung, polluted creeks, and a road system that barely connects. But coal is only the extraction layer people half know about. It's the one that makes it into campaign speeches and cable segments. It's the obvious chapter. Before the coal companies ever showed up, something else was stripped out of these mountains at an even larger scale, and it built the houses, the furniture, the newspapers, and the railroad ties that the rest of the country used without a second thought. That story rarely gets told because the evidence was floated downriver over a century ago. But the scars are still visible on every hillside. If you've ever driven through Appalachia and thought the mountains look scrubby, thin, second-rate compared to the forests out west, you were looking at a crime scene and mistaking it for scenery. Before the Civil War, the Appalachian Mountains held the largest temperate hardwood forest in North America. Old-growth timber stretching from northern Georgia to southern New York, a forest covering an area comparable to all of New England. Tulip poplars 8 feet across, white oaks that were mature before Columbus landed, and the American chestnut, a tree so dominant that roughly 1 out of every 4 trees in the Appalachian forest was a chestnut. And the nuts it dropped every fall fed both the wildlife and the families living underneath it. By the early 1900s, nearly all of it was gone. The logging boom hit Appalachia harder, faster, and more completely than most Americans realize. Because when people think about deforestation in the United States, they picture the Pacific Northwest, old-growth redwoods, spotted owl controversies, protesters chaining themselves to trees in Oregon. But the Appalachian forests were cut first, and they were cut with an efficiency that left almost nothing standing. In the decades after the Civil War, land speculators, most of them from out of state, moved through the mountains, buying timber rights from families who had lived on the land for generations. The prices were absurd, pennies an acre in some cases. And the legal instrument they used was something called a broad-form deed, a document that separated the surface rights from the mineral and timber rights below and above. The farmer kept the right to live on the surface. The company got the right to everything else. And the language was written so broadly that, in practice, the company could do almost anything to the surface in order to access what it had bought. Cut every tree, blast a road through a hillside, dam a creek. The family living on top had signed away more than they understood, and in many cases, they couldn't read the fine print, or read at all. Once the rights were locked up, the technology arrived. Band mills, massive steam-powered saws with continuous looped blades, could process logs that hand-operated mills never could. And narrow-gauge railroads, small enough to wind up steep hollows and across temporary bridges, carried the logs out of places no wagon could reach. The same pattern as coal, purpose-built infrastructure designed to extract a resource and move it somewhere else. The wood went everywhere. Appalachian hardwood became floorboards in East Coast row houses, furniture in Midwestern parlors, railroad ties under every expanding line, and pulp for the newspapers that people read about the frontier expansion they were funding with every subscription. The raw material left the mountains and became the physical substance of American domestic life, and the mountains got a paycheck and a wasteland. The logging companies left behind what the industry called slash, branches, bark, and treetops that weren't worth hauling out. Slash piled up across steep slopes, dried in the summer sun, and caught fire constantly. Wildfires burned not just the debris, but the topsoil itself. On a 40-degree slope with no root systems left to hold it, that soil washed away in the next hard rain and never came back. What you see today on a barren Appalachian hillside, thin trees, scrubby undergrowth, exposed rock, is not the natural state of that land. It's what grows back after the original forest, the topsoil, and the watershed have all been removed. The emptiness looks like nature. It's actually a receipt. Then came the second collapse, timed almost perfectly to make things worse. The American chestnut blight, a fungus accidentally imported from Asia, began killing chestnut trees in the early 1900s and spread across the entire Appalachian range within a few decades. Logging likely made it worse, removing mature trees and opening the canopy so the fungus could spread faster through weakened second growth. By the 1950s, the American chestnut was functionally extinct. The chestnut wasn't just a tree, it was the grocery store. Mountain families had depended on the annual harvest for food, animal feed, and cash income for generations. Hogs fattened on chestnuts. Children gathered them in baskets and sold them in town. When the chestnuts disappeared, that safety net vanished at the exact moment the timber jobs disappeared too. Two collapses overlapping. Families that had once been self-sufficient farmers and foragers were funneled into the mines because the mines were the only thing left hiring in a landscape that could no longer feed them on its own. One extraction wave set up the next. The timber cleared the surface. The coal companies moved in underneath. And the broad form deeds that had originally been written for timber turned out to cover mineral rights too. The same legal mechanism, the same outside owners, the same pattern of value leaving and damage staying. But timber and coal are at least visible. You can see a clear cut. You can see a mine. The next thing pulled from these mountains is something most people never think about, and it's sitting in your medicine cabinet, running through your plumbing, and sealed inside the screen you're watching right now. The Kanawha Valley, running along the Kanawha River in West Virginia, became one of the largest chemical manufacturing corridors in the Western Hemisphere. Not Houston, not Baton Rouge, a valley in West Virginia. And the reason comes down to what's under the ground. Long before the mountains existed, this part of North America was covered by a shallow inland sea. When it evaporated hundreds of millions of years ago, it left enormous deposits of salt, buried under layers of rock, that would later be compressed into the Appalachian Range. And salt, in an industrial context, is a feedstock. Dissolve it in water, run an electric current through the brine, and you get chlorine gas and sodium hydroxide, two of the most important precursor chemicals in manufacturing. Chlorine becomes PVC plastic, solvents, disinfectants, and pharmaceuticals. Sodium hydroxide becomes soap, paper, textiles, and aluminum processing chemicals. From one ancient evaporated ocean, you get the ingredients for a significant chunk of modern consumer life. The Kanawha Valley had the salt, the natural gas to fuel the reactions, and a river for cooling water and transport. Salt, fuel, and water stacked on top of each other by geology and connected by gravity. A chemical factory essentially pre-assembled underground and waiting for someone to plug it in. DuPont, Union Carbide, Monsanto, and Dow all built plants along the Kanawha River, turning a stretch of valley barely 50 miles long into what locals started calling Chemical Valley. And here's a detail almost nobody knows. Some of the earliest commercial uses of natural gas in the United States happened not in Texas or Oklahoma, but in West Virginia, where gas was first struck during salt drilling as early as 1815. The country's first natural gasoline plant was built in Sistersville, West Virginia in 1908. The fossil fuel age, at least for gas, has deep roots in Appalachia, and the region got the same deal it always gets. The resource left, the infrastructure decayed, and the credit went to whoever scaled it up somewhere else. The chemical plants brought higher wages than coal or timber. Real communities formed, but they also brought waste, dumped into the river, buried in unlined pits, vented into the air over neighborhoods where plant workers and their families lived. And in January of 2014, the extraction layers collided. A storage tank at a facility on the Elk River, a tributary of the Kanawha, leaked MCHM into the water supply. MCHM is a frothing agent used in coal preparation, helping separate impurities from coal before it's shipped. A chemical produced by the chemical industry to service the coal industry contaminated the drinking water of roughly 300,000 people across 9 counties. The coal needed processing. The chemical did the processing. The river carried both the chemical and the drinking water. And the people at the end of the pipe were the same people who'd been living alongside extraction for a century and a half. There's one more material worth mentioning, because you're probably looking at it right now. Appalachian sandstone deposits contain high-purity silica, a raw material for glass. Windows, bottles, fiberglass, screens. Some of the nation's silica has been quarried from mountains in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, and it may well have ended up in the glass you're looking through right now. So add it up. The electricity came from the coal, the house came from the timber, the plastic, the pipes, the antifreeze, the glass, from the chemistry buried in the same mountains. Which leads to the question that should now be uncomfortable. If this much wealth was pulled out of one region for over 150 years, where did all the money go? Here's the answer most people reach. Isolation. The mountains cut people off. The culture is insular. The coal ran out. It's a sad story, but it's basically a geography problem with no villain. Every part of that answer is wrong, and the real answer is simpler, uglier, and still operating right now. Appalachia isn't poor because it had nothing. It isn't poor because the resources ran out. It's poor because of the specific legal and financial mechanisms designed to ensure that the value of those resources was converted into wealth somewhere else. The mountains are a geography problem. The poverty is an ownership problem. Start with the land. Speculators and corporations use those broad-form deeds to buy mineral and timber rights across entire counties. A family could own their house, their garden, their front porch, and have absolutely no legal claim to the coal under their feet or the trees over their heads. Those rights belong to a company headquartered in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York, or Richmond. By the time researchers actually studied the pattern, the Appalachian Land Ownership Study in 1981, they found that across the counties they surveyed, roughly 3/4 of the land and over 4/5 of the mineral rights were held by absentee owners. Not local landowners, not even people who had ever visited. Corporations and holding companies whose addresses were in office towers hundreds of miles away. The people living on the land were, in economic terms, tenants on top of someone else's wealth. And that distinction decided everything. The mineral wealth underneath the county was chronically underassessed, and the corporations that owned it paid a fraction of what it was worth into local tax rolls. The extraction counties, the places where the ground was physically torn open, were funded at a fraction of what the extracted wealth would have supported if it had been properly taxed. The wealth was under the ground, the poverty was on the surface, and the legal boundary between them was a signature on a piece of paper from 1880-something. This is the mechanism that no amount of bootstrap rhetoric can overcome. You can't build an economy on land you don't own. You can't tax wealth that's chronically undervalued on the books. You can't fund a school system on the property taxes from surface rights when the valuable part of the property, the minerals, is assessed at a sliver of its true worth. And if you think this is a historical problem that expired with the coal industry, here's where the story gets current. Right now, underneath Appalachia, sits one of the largest natural gas reserves on Earth. The Marcellus Shale and the Utica Shale, formations stretching from West Virginia through Pennsylvania and into Ohio, contain enough recoverable gas to make the region one of the top energy-producing zones in the world. The fracking boom arrived in the 2000s, and the drilling pads started appearing on ridgetops and in hollows across the same counties that had been mined for coal for a century. And the ownership pattern is identical. The mineral rights under those hollows belong, overwhelmingly, to the same kinds of absentee owners, energy companies, investment firms, holding corporations. The wells get drilled. The gas flows through pipelines to cities and export terminals. The royalties leave. The local roads get wrecked by truck traffic. The water table gets questioned. And the communities sitting on top of a geological fortune still can't fund their school systems. It's the same extraction logic applied to a new resource. Coal was the first draft. Timber was the prelude. Chemicals were the middle act. Natural gas is the current chapter, and the legal architecture hasn't changed. Then there's the layer that isn't about rocks at all. In the 2000s and 2010s, a different kind of extraction hit Appalachia: pharmaceutical distribution. Drug companies and wholesale distributors shipped prescription opioids into tiny Appalachian towns at per capita rates that defied any medical explanation. Pharmacies in communities of a few thousand people received millions of pills. The numbers were so grotesque that they should have triggered alarms immediately, and they did, years too late. A region that had been hollowed out by a century of resource extraction was then targeted for its despair. The pain was real. The pills were profitable. The damage was catastrophic. It was extraction applied not to geology but to people, and it followed the same path. The product flowed in, the money flowed out, and the consequences stayed. Pull back far enough and the pattern becomes almost mechanical. Timber in the 1800s, coal from the 1880s through the 20th century, chemicals from the 1900s onward, natural gas right now. Each wave follows the same sequence. Outside capital identifies a resource, acquires legal control of it through mechanisms the local population doesn't fully understand or can't contest, extracts the resource using infrastructure designed to move value out, pays as little as possible into the local economy, and leaves when the resource thins or the price drops. The community that remains is left with the ecological damage, the health consequences, the underfunded institutions, and the reputation, lazy, backward, left behind, that makes it easy for the rest of the country to look away. That reputation is the final extraction. Take the wealth, leave the poverty, then blame the poverty on the people instead of the taking. So here's what the map actually shows, if you read it honestly. The next time you drive across a steel bridge, flip a light switch, take a pill from a plastic bottle, or look through a glass window, there's a hollow in West Virginia or Kentucky where the raw material for that object was pulled out of the ground, loaded onto a train, or pumped through a pipeline, and sent to the place where you're standing. The mountain got shorter, the company got paid, and the family on the surface is still there, living on land they own above wealth that belongs to someone else.